Like the video, subscribe, and comment your country below so I know who's listening tonight. Turn off the lights and put on headphones for the full horror experience. Let's begin the nightmare. If you're brave enough. I never believed the stories about the valley until the night I found myself walking alone into its throat of shadow, clutching nothing but a dying flashlight and a radio that crackled more with whispers than static. Because when you grow up hearing about the Skinwalker, Ye Nald Lushii, the Shape Stealer, the Night Runner, you tell yourself it's just another desert tale meant to keep kids from wandering out where the land dips into places it shouldn't. But I wasn't a kid anymore. I was 27, a wildlife surveyor for the state, someone who trusted tracks and scat and soil samples more than legends. Yet the moment I stepped past the weather-beaten sign reading "No entry after dusk," the air changed in a way I've never been able to describe, heavy but empty, like something enormous was breathing out while everything else was holding its breath, and the silence didn't feel natural. It felt aware, like the kind of silence that happens when predators are listening. So I kept moving deeper into the valley, cursing myself for taking this assignment alone, because the locals had warned me, especially old man Yazzie, who lived at the edge of the reservation line, telling me in a voice dry as bone, "You do not walk there after the sun bleeds out. That place remembers every shape it has taken." And I laughed then, pretending I didn't feel something crawl under my skin when he said it, but now with the last smear of dusk fading behind the broken ridges, I realized how foolish that laugh had been. The ground here wasn't just earth. Every step felt like pressing down on old memories, ones that didn't belong to me, ones that pushed back. And I kept hearing echoes of footsteps behind me even though I never saw anything when I turned around. But the dirt would be disturbed, small prints appearing then vanishing, sometimes human-shaped, sometimes not, and the flashlight flickered like an animal trying to pull away from my hand. There was a smell too, faint at first, like wet fur and rotting weeds, the kind of scent you catch a split second before a wild creature bursts out from the dark, but nothing burst out. It only watched, because that's what the Skinwalker was known for, watching until it learned your fear well enough to wear it. And around an hour in I reached the ravine where a sheep rancher had reported a man walking on all fours faster than a wolf, which was why I was here in the first place. Though now the idea that I could explain any of this in a neat official report seemed ridiculous, because the further I walked the more my radio began picking up voices, not English, not Navajo, something stretched and reversed, like words being chewed before they were spoken. And I tried to call dispatch, but the only thing that came through the speaker was a low mimic of my own voice whispering my name, long and wrong, and I swear my blood turned cold enough to crack. But I kept moving because my truck was too far behind me and the canyon walls were already closing like jaws around the last strip of moon. And then I heard it, the first real sound of the night, the unmistakable cry of a woman calling for help, breaking the silence like a snapped bone, echoing from somewhere up ahead near the old dry creek bed, a place no one lived, a place no one should have been, and everything in me said do not follow that voice, because it didn't rise and fall like a person's cry would. It was too perfect, like a recording, like bait. But the job forced my feet forward even while my instincts screamed at me to run. So I reached the creek bed and found no woman, no footprints, nothing but a cold wind that stank of blood and iron and something like burnt hair. And that was when I saw the shape on the ridge. At first just a silhouette against the thin slice of moon, but then it moved wrong, its limbs bending like they hadn't learned how joints were supposed to work, and it crouched, its head twitching as if listening to my heartbeat. Then it stood upright in a single, jerking motion that made my stomach twist, and every instinct in my body recognized it as human-shaped but not human, a mockery wearing the outline of a person. And I froze as it called my name again in that same warped version of my voice, mimicking even the panic I tried to hide. And then it dropped to all fours and sprinted down the slope toward me with impossible speed, kicking up dirt like an animal twice its size. But when my flashlight caught its face, God, its face! It wasn't a face at all, just stretched skin pulled too tight over something that shifted underneath like muscles weren't fixed in place, and its mouth opened wide, but the scream that came out wasn't its own. It was the woman's cry again, looped perfectly, like it was wearing her terror too, and I stumbled backward, nearly slipping into the creek bed. But the thing stopped just short of the light's reach, tilting its head as if studying me, learning how to become me. And when it whispered again, my voice now nearly perfect except for the wet clicking underneath, I understood the part of the legend I had ignored. A skinwalker doesn't just steal shapes, it steals stories, lives, identities, emotions, memories, everything you are, and as it stepped 1 foot into the beam of the flashlight, I could see a fresh layer of skin glistening as if newly claimed. And that was when I realized it had been following someone else before me. Someone who was likely gone, replaced, hollowed out, and now it had chosen me. And as the flashlight finally died, plunging me into a darkness that felt alive and hungry, I understood that nothing human was walking out of this valley unchanged, least of all me. I didn't sleep for the next 40 hours after escaping the valley. Not that I truly escaped, because even when I stumbled back to my truck at dawn with dust caked into my teeth and the smell of something dead clinging to my clothes, it felt like the valley had followed me, sticking to my skin like a second shadow, and the whole way back down the service road I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing sprinting on all fours behind me, stretching its limbs, smiling with that stolen human mouth. But the road stayed empty, which somehow felt worse, because emptiness meant it had time to learn, time to hide, time to wear another shape. And when I finally reached the ranger station, I babbled through what happened, but the chief, Reynolds, just stared at me with that stiff disbelief people wear when they're trying not to laugh in your face, telling me I must have been hallucinating from dehydration. But when he leaned closer to inspect the scratches on my jacket, his expression changed ever so slightly, like he recognized something he shouldn't, though he said nothing and told me to sit in the infirmary while they called in backup. And that's when I overheard over the radio. Another missing hiker reported from the northern ridge, the same area I'd just come from. A young guy from Phoenix whose friends claimed he wandered off after hearing someone calling his name, and the moment I heard that, something in me snapped into place, because that was exactly how the Skinwalker hunted. First learning how to imitate the voices of people it had already taken, then using those voices to lure new prey deeper into the valley. And when I said that aloud, the medic glanced at me sharply, her hands tightening around the bandage roll like she knew more than she wanted to, but she just said, "Don't talk about that here," which only made the fear build in my throat, because fear doesn't grow from the unknown. It grows when others start acting like they know something and refuse to say it. And as the team prepped to head out to search for the missing hiker, Reynolds ordered me to stay put, but I followed anyway, refusing to sit alone in a sterile room where every reflection felt like it might twitch and look back at me. So I grabbed a spare radio and rode along in the second ATV toward the ridge trail, the morning sun doing nothing to warm the valley, which seemed even colder than the night before, its wind slicing across the land like it carried whispers. The deeper we went, the more the environment felt wrong. Birds gone, insects silent, even the coyotes were absent, and when wildlife disappears, something bigger is out there. So when we found the first sign of the missing hiker, his shoe, torn clean through by something with claws far larger than any local predator, the team stopped pretending it was just a routine search, especially when one of the younger rangers spotted strange tracks in the dirt, long, deep, but inconsistent, as if the creature changed its weight distribution mid-stride, sometimes walking like a man, sometimes running like an animal, and sometimes dragging itself like something learning how to use its own stolen limbs. And I watched their faces pale as they followed the trail toward a ravine dotted with caves, the same ravine I had run from hours earlier, and I warned them not to go inside because that was the Skinwalker's nest, its place of transformation where it shed the remnants of its previous victims. But Reynolds barked at me to shut up and ordered 2 rangers to scout the nearest cave, and I swear the valley itself seemed to pulse when they stepped inside, as if exhaling in anticipation, and seconds later we heard a scream. Not theirs, but a perfect imitation of the missing hiker yelling for help, echoing from deeper inside the darkness. And one ranger bolted forward to chase the sound while the rest of us yelled at him to stop, because it wasn't the hiker, that much I knew, but the Skinwalker learning a new voice, adding it to its collection. And sure enough, the moment the ranger rounded a corner inside the cave, His scream gurgled into a wet, choking noise, and then silence fell so abruptly that my skin prickled, and we ran inside where the stale air reeked of copper and rot, and in the glow of our flashlights we found blood on the walls, smeared in clawed handprints, but worse than the blood were the scratches, symbols, sigils, marks carved by something with fingers that could bend too far backward, symbols that the medic later said looked like old protection wards defiled and reversed, meaning the creature either understood them or was mocking them, and deeper in the cave we found the ranger who'd run ahead. But not all of him. His face untouched, eerily peaceful, but his body hollowed like something had scooped out his insides cleanly, not with teeth but with hands, as though the Skinwalker took only what it needed, leaving behind a shell that still looked human enough to terrify the mind. And that was when another voice called from deeper in the cave. "Help! Please! I'm hurt!" And we all froze because it was the missing hiker's voice, but it was too close, echoing in a way that didn't match the direction of the sound, almost like it was circling us, learning our positions, gauging our reactions, and the rookie ranger beside me whispered, "Don't answer it. If you answer, it learns you." And I realized he knew the legend too, maybe from his own family, and when the voice called again, it sounded exactly like me, word for word, tone for tone, repeating the same frightened thing I'd said earlier near the station, and the team backed toward the exit, weapons raised, but the voice kept shifting. First the hiker, then the dead ranger, then the medic from camp, then a child, then a deep inhuman rasp that made our blood freeze, and when we finally burst out of the cave into daylight, something moved behind us, scraping stone, dragging bone, and the rookie ranger screamed when he saw a shape at the mouth of the cave beginning to crawl out. Elongated limbs, shifting shoulders, a face that flickered between forms like a slideshow of stolen lives. And Reynolds fired a warning shot even though bullets were said not to kill it unless blessed or coated in ash, but the creature didn't flinch, just retreated into the dark as if laughing silently. And after we fled back to the ATVs, shaken and splattered with blood that wasn't ours, Reynolds finally said the words no ranger ever wanted to utter. "We're calling in tribal law enforcement and a federal team. This valley is closed." But closing a valley doesn't stop something that walks in any skin it chooses, and that night, while we regrouped at the station, I stepped into the restroom to wash my face and nearly collapsed when I saw a shape behind me in the mirror. My own reflection smiling a half-second later than I did. The valley seemed to shrink around Ethan as the frost-thick dawn bled across the mountains, turning every rock, every twisted sage bush, every distant shadow into something that watched him with silent, patient intent, and though exhaustion gnawed at his bones, he forced himself forward, following the faint remnants of the old shepherd trail that wound between the boulders like a forgotten scar. But the air carried a strange vibration now, an almost infrasound hum that trembled inside his ribs, rather than in his ears, as if the valley itself were waking up and remembering an ancient hunger, and with each uneasy step he took, that hum grew thicker, denser, wrapping around him like invisible spider silk, until he felt certain something was studying each movement he made. Not the open, predatory scrutiny of a normal animal, but the intelligent, deliberate observation of something that had learned how humans walked, breathed, hesitated, and feared, something that had practiced wearing human shapes like clothing. When he reached the creek, the water moved strangely, not flowing downstream but swirling in a slow, circular pattern as though stirred by a great submerged hand, and above it stood the remnants of an abandoned hogan, just the rotted foundation logs and a doorway frame leaning crookedly like a broken jaw. And inside that dark rectangle, Ethan saw movement, a flicker of pale skin, a silhouette that was too tall, its limbs bent at angles that made his stomach drop, but when he blinked, it was gone, replaced by the empty, cold interior. He whispered to himself that it was only exhaustion, only fear, only the memory of the previous night clinging to him like sap, but the valley disagreed, for the hum in the air shifted pitch as though responding to his thoughts, as if the thing listening had tilted its unnatural head and smiled. He pushed on, deeper between canyon walls that rose so tightly he could touch both sides with outstretched arms, and every gust of wind carried faint human sounds. Breathing, footsteps, occasional shuddering gasps that might have once belonged to him in another moment of terror, but these breaths were not his own, and they came from all directions, echoing, layering, mocking. He saw more tracks too, enormous deer-like prints that suddenly shifted into barefoot human impressions, then back again, as though a creature kept changing its form mid-step, testing shapes like clay between its fingers, and some of those tracks were recent, fresh enough that tiny droplets of dark fluid dotted the stones around them, thick and metallic smelling, not quite blood but something older, something that had no business being warm in the morning air. The old stories his grandfather once told him returned now, not as distant superstitions whispered around a fire, but as cold truth pressed against the back of his neck. Stories of the Ye-Nald Lushii who could slip into any skin, any voice, any memory. Stories of the cursed ones who traded humanity for power, weaving themselves into the wilderness so deeply that the land itself became an extension of their body. Ethan tried to steady his breath, tried not to let the panic in his throat erupt into a run that would surely draw attention, but then he heard it, his mother's voice. Not as he remembered it in life, warm, tired, grounding, but stretched thin, pulled across an impossible distance. The vowels cracked as though spoken by a mouth that didn't remember how lips worked. Ethan, it called, a warped imitation that rose from behind him, from in front of him, from above him all at once, and he froze because the thing had never used her voice before, had never dared. But now it was rummaging through his memories, selecting the one sound he was defenseless against, and the realization burned through him like ice. He kept his eyes fixed on the trail, refusing to turn, but he could hear footsteps coming up behind him. Bare feet on stone. Too slow, too deliberate, each step landing exactly when his heartbeat did, syncing with it, controlling it, as though it were trying to crawl inside his pulse. And then another voice joined, this time his own, saying his name back to him perfectly, as if mocking the very idea of identity, as if claiming, "I know you better than you know yourself." He stumbled forward, half running now, the canyon widening just enough for sunlight to touch the ground ahead, but even the light seemed wrong. Dust heavy, beams sharp like claws, and something crossed through it, a shadow of a human shape that was too stretched, too rippled, as though composed of overlapping silhouettes. When he reached the old livestock pen, a collapsed wooden circle half swallowed by sand, he saw symbols etched into the stones around it, old protective markings carved by ancestors long before roads or fences existed, and they pulsed faintly under the sunlight, glowing like embers in ash. But between those symbols, deep gouges scarred the stone, fresh claw marks, evidence that something had tried to break the circle open from the outside or perhaps from within. The hum in the valley dropped suddenly, falling into a frequency that shook Ethan's teeth, and the wind died completely, leaving the world so silent he could hear the blood inside his ears. Then the silence broke, not with a roar or a scream, but with a slow, dragging inhale, like some enormous lung filling itself for the first time in centuries. From behind a fallen juniper trunk stepped a figure that made Ethan's mind rebel, not because it was monstrous but because it was almost human. Its proportions correct but its movements too smooth, too practiced, like a puppet trying very hard to convince its audience it needed strings. Its skin was familiar. Its hair was familiar. Its eyes, no. They were empty. Perfect glass marbles that only mimicked what eyes were supposed to be. And as it stepped into clearer view, Ethan's knees weakened. The creature had taken his form, copying it with frightening precision, wearing his face like it belonged to him, except for the mouth, which was too wide, as though the skin had stretched to fit a smile it had never evolved to make. It raised an arm, his arm, and pointed at him, and when it spoke, the valley seemed to tilt. "You left me," it said in his voice, but layered with a deeper resonance, as if many voices spoke through one throat. "You walked out of the dark. I had to follow." Ethan turned and ran, crashing through brush and stumbling over rocks, driven not by instinct but by a raw animal terror that eclipsed thought. Branches slashed his face, stones slid under his boots, the hum roared like a swarm of hornets inside his skull. And behind him the footfalls multiplied, no longer just one copy but many, dozens, each wearing a slightly different version of his own gait, each whispering his mother's voice or his own name or guttural phrases in a language that tasted like metal and rot. He didn't stop until he reached the base of the valley's far ridge, where an ancient mine entrance yawned black and cold, its timbers swollen and split with age, its darkness deep enough to erase whole worlds, and the footsteps behind him stopped suddenly. The valley fell silent again. Too silent. He turned, chest heaving, sweat freezing on his skin, and saw nothing but empty sand and windless air. The copies were gone. The voices were gone. But the hum remained, faint now, like laughter buried under stone. Ethan realized then that the mine wasn't abandoned, not to the creature, not to whatever history had birthed it, and the truth struck him like a fever. The Skinwalker wasn't chasing him out of hunger or rage or cruelty. It was herding him, guiding him, driving him exactly where it wanted him to go. And as the mine's darkness breathed cold air across his legs, he understood with sick clarity that the real hunt was just beginning. As night bled into the valley and the sky turned into a dying bruise of purple and black, Ethan, Lila, and old Mara followed the narrow trail leading toward the ancient canyon mouth where the first Skinwalker was said to have been born, the air pulsing with a low vibration like a heartbeat hidden beneath the soil, and with every step Ethan felt the presence behind him growing closer, not a footstep or breath but a pressure, a weight, something aware and eager, something that had been hunting him long before he even entered the valley, and now that they were approaching the place where its power was strongest, he felt it circling him like a predator circling a dying animal, savoring the moment before the kill. Yet Mara kept forcing them forward, whispering chants under her breath, clutching a small jar of red earth she said carried the last protection her people had, though even she didn't seem confident it would be enough. The wind cut sideways across them, carrying with it a smell of damp fur, rot, and old blood, and Lila clung to Ethan's arm as shadows stretched in unnatural directions, rising from stones and bushes and forming shapes that should not exist, tall misshapen silhouettes that loomed and shrank and shifted like a dozen bodies stitched into one, and Ethan tried not to look directly at them because every time he did, he saw faces he knew. His father's face, his childhood friends, his own, twisting in silent screams before dissolving back into darkness. And he realized the Skinwalker wasn't just mimicking voices and bodies, it was mimicking minds, memories, history, turning everything familiar into a weapon. And when they reached the canyon entrance, a deep split in the earth shaped like a mouth screaming open. He felt the temperature drop so violently his breath crystallized and drifted like smoke, the stones slick with frost despite it being late summer. And from within the canyon came a sound like bones rubbing together in a slow grinding rhythm, a sound that made Lila's knees buckle and Mara clutch her ears as blood trickled between her fingers, though she kept chanting despite the pain. Because the only thing stopping the Skinwalker from tearing them apart already was the fragile ribbon of words Mara maintained as she walked. Ethan forced himself inside, the canyon walls rising straight up like cathedral pillars carved by something ancient and cruel. And as he moved deeper he found claw marks high above his head, gouged into stone far too thick for any human to break, and they glowed faintly like fresh wounds, as if whatever carved them was still close. The canyon air grew thicker until each breath felt like inhaling warm blood, and the ground under them began to bulge and pulse like they were walking on some enormous buried creature's veins. And then the voices began. First one, soft and familiar, his mother's voice calling his childhood nickname. Then another, his father telling him to come home. Then hundreds of voices, screaming, whispering, laughing, begging, all overlapping, all speaking directly into his thoughts, drowning Mara's chants and Lila's frightened breaths, the voices rising to a deafening, maddening crescendo until Ethan screamed back, clawing at his ears. But the sound continued inside his skull as the canyon around them seemed to shift like a throat swallowing them deeper. Finally Mara threw a handful of red earth against the canyon wall, and the voices abruptly cut off as the rock rippled like flesh and peeled open, revealing a chamber inside, circular and impossibly smooth, lit by no flame yet glowing faintly red from veins of stone pulsing like arteries, and in the center lay a mound of bones, animal, human, and something in between, twisted together in a heap that radiated a cold hunger so deep Ethan felt it in his own stomach, an emptiness gnawing at him with a promise of power if he only stepped closer. And standing atop that mound was the Skinwalker in its true form. No longer hiding behind the stolen shape of Ethan's mother or father or friends, but revealing its towering, contorted body covered in fur that seemed to shift like smoke, its limbs too long, its joints bending backward, its face a smooth pale mask without eyes but with a mouth that stretched from ear to ear, filled not with teeth but with hundreds of tiny finger-like bones twitching like worms hungry for flesh. And when it turned its eyeless head toward Ethan, the bones inside its mouth clicked in, a rhythm that made Lila collapse in a sobbing heap and Mara stumble forward to raise her arms, chanting louder though her voice cracked with blood. The Skinwalker listened to her like a bored god listening to an insect trying to curse it. Then it lifted one elongated arm and snapped its fingers backward, sending a wave of invisible force across the chamber, flinging Mara against the far wall with such violence that Ethan heard at least 2 ribs break, yet she kept chanting, dragging herself upright even as the Skinwalker's jaws clicked faster. And Ethan realized then that the creature wasn't attacking him. No, it was waiting, expecting, wanting him to step closer, wanting him to accept something it had been whispering since the valley first sensed his presence. And he suddenly understood the truth Mara had always feared but never said. The Skinwalker wasn't just hunting him. It had chosen him, marked him, remembered him from childhood when he had unknowingly wandered into its territory and seen a glimpse of it in the trees. A moment he had buried as imagination, but that the creature had treated as a pact, and now it wanted him to complete what began that day by taking its place or surrendering to it. Ethan felt the pull inside his bones, the strange desire to step forward, to give in, to let the canyon swallow him and wear him like a skin. But Lila, trembling and barely conscious, whispered his name with such raw terror and love that it cut through the fog in his mind, and Ethan turned to her, seeing her bloodied face, her shaking hands reaching for him, and he realized he wasn't willing to let her die for something he didn't even choose. So he turned back to the creature, forcing his mouth to speak even though every instinct told him to run, and he shouted for Mara to tell him what to do, and Mara, coughing blood and slurring her final strength, told him the only way to end the curse was to destroy the heart buried in the bone mound, the heart that didn't beat, the heart not of flesh but of memory, an ancient talisman the Skinwalker used to anchor itself in this world, and Ethan saw it then, half hidden in the bone heap, glowing faintly like an ember breathing, and he knew he had exactly one chance. He ran, sprinting across the chamber as the Skinwalker shrieked, the sound shaking loose chips of stone from the ceiling, and the creature lunged, its limbs unfolding like broken spider legs, claws slicing through the air exactly where Ethan had been a second earlier. But Ethan dove toward the mound, grabbing the pulsing heart-shaped stone just as the Skinwalker screamed in a voice made of every person it had ever killed, a scream of fury, betrayal, and hunger, the walls trembling as cracks split open and dust rained from above. Ethan felt the stone burning in his hand, searing his skin as if it were alive and trying to burrow into him, but he squeezed harder, ignoring the agony, ignoring the creature's claws raking his back and tearing deep into his shoulder, ignoring Lila's terrified cries, and he slammed the stone against a jagged piece of bone with every ounce of strength he had left, the impact sending a shockwave through him. And for a moment the entire chamber went silent, so silent he thought he had died. Then the stone cracked, a thin fracture spreading across its surface, and the Skinwalker shrieked again, this time in fear, and lunged at him with all its remaining power, but Ethan screamed back, lifting the stone and smashing it again and again until it finally shattered like brittle glass, exploding into a cloud of glowing red dust that swirled upward as if sucked into an invisible vortex, and the Skinwalker convulsed horribly, its body folding inward as if the air around it were crushing it, its limbs twisting until they snapped off like dried sticks, its eyeless head splitting open as a torrent of black smoke erupted from it, swirling into the same vortex and leaving behind only a charred and collapsing skeleton that fell onto the bone mound with a hollow rattle. The ground buckled beneath them, the chamber collapsing as Mara shouted for them to run, and Ethan grabbed Lila, dragging her toward the canyon entrance as walls split open, boulders crashing down, and a roar like a dying storm filled the air, the last remnants of the Skinwalker's power being ripped from the valley. They stumbled into the night just as the canyon behind them imploded, sending a blast of dust and debris into the sky, and Mara collapsed onto her knees, whispering prayers of release and grief, because though the creature was dead, the land would never be the same, and Ethan, shaking and bleeding, held Lila close as the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, unaware that even as the sun began to rise, something deep in the dust still pulsed faintly, something that had not died but merely been wounded, something that waited for the next traveler brave, or foolish, enough to enter the valley of the Skinwalker. Just after the sun rose over the valley, turning the broken rocks gold and softening the dust that hovered in the air like the breath of a dying monster, Ethan felt for the first time that the world around him was real again, no longer distorted by the Skinwalker's presence, but the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the silence of a battlefield after the last scream has faded, heavy with the ghosts of everything that had happened. And as he and Lila helped Mara to her feet, the old woman trembling but alive, they saw the canyon behind them collapsed entirely, sealed shut as if the earth had finally closed its mouth and swallowed the ancient creature's birthplace forever. Yet Mara, looking at the ruins with hollow eyes, whispered that destruction did not always mean an ending, that some curses sank deeper when buried, and Ethan didn't want to believe her, needing desperately to think that everything was finally over. But deep in his chest was a weight he couldn't ignore, a lingering cold that felt like the creature's breath still clinging to him. They made the long walk back through the valley, past the twisted trees and scorched stones, and Ethan noticed the land looked different now. Not healed, not alive, but drained, as if the Skinwalker's death had sucked out decades of life from the soil, leaving behind dry cracked earth and trees whose branches pointed skyward like skeletal fingers begging for rain they would never feel again. And as they passed the ridge where Ethan once saw the creature as a child, he felt a strange pull, a tug in his bones like the valley was calling his name one last time, and he remembered the moment he had buried deep in his memory. Him wandering away from his family's campsite, following what he thought was a lost dog, only to see a creature crouched at the tree line, watching him with eyes that weren't human, a creature that mimicked his mother's voice but got the tone wrong, as though it was practicing, learning him, and Ethan had run back to camp crying, telling his parents he saw a monster, but they had laughed, comforting him, tucking him into his sleeping bag, and assuring him it was just the wind. But now he understood the truth. The Skinwalker hadn't found him in adulthood by chance. It had marked him that night, had tasted his fear, had followed his life from the shadows, waiting for him to return. And Ethan wondered how many years of nightmare-filled sleep and strange whispers at night were not in his head but were echoes of the valley calling him back. When the three of them finally reached Mara's cabin, the old woman insisted on tending to their wounds despite her ribs being broken, crushing herbs and burning sage, whispering protections over Ethan and Lila, telling Ethan he would feel the creature inside him for days, maybe weeks, because the kind of evil he fought was not the kind that died quietly. It was the kind that left an imprint, a stain, a crack in the soul that could let the darkness in if he wasn't careful, and Ethan nodded though he didn't fully understand, exhausted and barely able to stay awake as Lila leaned against him, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears, her arms still shaking. That night they stayed in the cabin because moving further was impossible, and even as they slept, the valley outside remained unnaturally still, as if listening, waiting, and Ethan drifted in and out of dreams filled with snapping bones and clicking teeth, waking with his heart pounding and the taste of dust in his mouth. But every time he looked around, the cabin was still, only the dim lantern flickering on Mara's sleeping form, and Lila curled against his shoulder, breathing softly. In the morning, they left the valley with the slow caution of survivors leaving a war zone, making their way back to the outskirts of town where they found help, and for days the sheriff questioned them, not believing a word, insisting the canyon collapse was due to a small earthquake. But Ethan and Lila didn't fight the disbelief. They were too tired, too traumatized, and some part of Ethan was grateful no one believed them, because believing would mean the truth mattered, and he wanted the truth to stay buried with the creature. Weeks passed, the nightmares lingering but slowly fading. And Ethan found himself waking some mornings without remembering the creature's clicking voice, while Lila, healed, though she rarely spoke of the night in the canyon, and Mara, though badly injured, continued to live alone in her cabin, guarding the valley as she had always done, though she warned Ethan before he left that the land was never truly done with those it touched, and that if he ever felt the cold return, he must stay far from the valley, must resist whatever call he might hear, because the creature's influence, even dying, was a powerful thing. Life slowly returned to something resembling normal, Ethan and Lila settling into a small apartment in town, trying to pretend they were just two ordinary people who had survived something ordinary. But sometimes Ethan caught Lila staring at the window at night, her expression distant, as though listening for something she feared, and sometimes Ethan heard faint clicking sounds in the walls or in the quiet of the early dawn. But every time he searched, there was nothing. 3 months later Ethan visited Mara to thank her one final time, bringing her food and supplies, and found the old woman weaker than before, her voice thready and tired, saying the collapse of the canyon had taken much of her strength because the Skinwalker's power had fed on her vigilance for years, and without the creature active, the land had fallen into a cold kind of silence that drained her. But she smiled gently, telling Ethan that she felt peace for the first time in decades, knowing that the thing she spent her life fearing had finally been broken by his hands. Ethan left her cabin in late afternoon, feeling strangely hopeful as he walked down the trail, the golden light painting the valley in soft warmth that made it seem almost beautiful again, and he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was truly over. But just before he reached the highway where his truck was parked, a soft breeze carried a familiar sound, the faint clicking of tiny bones, rhythmic and slow, coming from deep beneath the earth, so faint he couldn't be sure if it was real or just memory. But when he turned toward the valley, he saw a small swirl of red dust rise from the collapsed canyon, glowing for a moment before dispersing into the air like ash, and the ground beneath his feet gave the slightest tremor, a whisper of movement, as if something deep below had shifted in its sleep. Ethan stood frozen, breath tight in his chest, and in that moment he understood the terrible truth Mara had feared from the beginning. The Skinwalker had not died. It had been wounded, broken, stripped of its anchor, but something that old, something born from hunger and darkness older than any tribe, any land, any human history, did not die from broken bones and shattered stone hearts. It changed, it retreated, it waited, and now it slept somewhere deeper, somewhere darker, waiting for the land to heal enough to call another wanderer, another child, another lost soul into the valley. And Ethan whispered a quiet prayer that he would never hear that call again, that the valley would forget his name. But as he climbed into his truck and started the engine, his rearview mirror flickered with movement. Just a flash, a shadow crossing the tree line in a way no animal ever moved, and Ethan drove away without looking back, knowing the valley still watched him, knowing the Skinwalker story was not over, not truly, because evil that ancient does not end. It only sleeps, and dreams of the next face it will wear.